The thing about working the night shift at Sullivan's was that you stopped noticing the smell of stale beer and despair after about 6 months. Leo had been there for 2 years, and by now the sour-sweet tang of old lager and the sharp sting of industrial floor wax had become as invisible to him as his own heartbeat. He moved through it all like a ghost, wiping down the mahogany bar, stacking glasses in the overhead racks, nodding at the regulars who'd long stopped seeing him as a person and had instead categorized him as furniture that occasionally brought them drinks and listened to their problems with a sympathetic ear. The bar itself was a relic from another era, all dark wood and brass fittings, with a long mirror behind the bottles that had been there since Prohibition. The mirror was spotted with age, the silver backing peeling in places, but Leo had grown fond of its imperfections. It showed him a version of himself that was softer around the edges, less worn down by the weight of the world. On good nights, he could almost believe that the man in the mirror wasn't drowning. At 6:45 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, the afterwork crowd was thinning out, leaving behind the usual debris. Puddles of condensation on the scarred bar top from glasses that had been set down too hard, crumpled napkin towers that looked like tiny monuments to someone's afternoon boredom, the faint electric hum of a city settling into its evening skin. The rain had been hammering Boston all day, a relentless gray curtain that turned the streets into rivers and the sidewalks into treacherous sheets of wet concrete. Through the streaked windows, the streetlights were starting to flicker on, casting watery pools of orange light onto the glistening pavement. Leo was 29, but his shoulders carried the weight of someone who'd been holding up the world since he was 17. It was a specific kind of exhaustion, the bone-deep, soul-weary fatigue that came from watching someone you love die by inches while the universe cheerfully asked for more money. Between his younger sister Sophie's chemo treatments at Mass General and the third eviction notice taped to his door in Somerville, rest was a luxury he'd long ago stopped affording himself. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and populated with dreams where he ran endlessly toward a door that kept getting further away, where he reached for Sophie's hand and felt her slipping through his fingers. Leo, Table 6 needs clearing. Marty, the owner, a man who looked like he'd been assembled from leftover parts of other, less fortunate men, with a face like a clenched fist and a personality to match, jerked his thumb toward the back, without looking up from his racing form. Marty was a man who'd given up on dreams a long time ago, and he expected everyone around him to do the same. On it, Marty. He grabbed a bus tub and wound through the tables on autopilot, his mind already calculating how many more shifts until he could afford the next round of Sophie's medication. The number was never good. It was always a number that made him want to put his fist through a wall, a number that grew larger every time he looked at it, like some malevolent mathematical creature that fed on hope and spat out despair. He'd done the math 100 times, 1,000 times, and the answer was always the same. Not enough, never enough. The front door opened at exactly 7 p.m. The draft that came in smelled like wet pavement and the kind of money that didn't have to worry about eviction notices. Expensive cologne and leather and the particular scent of people who'd never had to choose between groceries and heat, who'd never stood in a pharmacy aisle trying to decide which medication to skip this month. A thick-necked man in a too-tight polo shirt walked in first, scanning the room the way a dog checks corners before entering a yard. His eyes moved with the flat, professional assessment of someone who'd been trained to spot threats in crowds, to identify exits and potential dangers before he'd even taken 3 steps into the room. Behind him, almost invisible in his shadow, was the boy. He couldn't have been older than 6. He wore a cream-colored wool coat with toggle buttons that probably cost more than Leo's monthly rent. The wool soft and expensive-looking, clearly chosen by someone who cared about quality. Polished Mary Janes that clicked softly on the worn floorboards, their soles barely scuffed. A small navy beret sitting crooked on dark curls that looked like they'd been carefully brushed by someone who cared very much about appearances. But his face was what stopped Leo cold every time. It was the face of a child who had forgotten what playing looked like, who had never known the simple joy of running through a park or building a tower of blocks just to knock it down. His eyes, enormous and nearly black, stared at nothing. Not at the sticky floor, not at the flickering neon signs, not at the boisterous group of college students in the corner laughing too loudly. At nothing. The hollow, thousand-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much too young, who'd had his childhood stolen before it had even really begun. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around. He didn't swing his small legs or hum under his breath or do any of the thousand small things that children did when they were still children, when the world was still a place of wonder and not just a landscape of threats. He moved like a sleepwalker, his small hand gripping the thick-necked man's jacket as if it were the only anchor in a storm, the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Leo had been watching this ritual for 8 weeks now. Every night at exactly 7 p.m., the same back booth with the torn vinyl and the wobbly leg that Leo had been meaning to fix for 6 months. The same silent child. The same loudmouth guard who treated the boy like an inconvenient piece of luggage, a burden to be endured rather than a person to be loved. They sat down. The thick-necked man, who Leo had mentally named Rourke because of the faded tattoo on his knuckles that read Rourke in blocky, prison-issue letters, the ink smudged and old, pulled out his phone immediately and started a loud, grunting conversation about somebody named Denny and a shipment that was 3 days hot. His voice carried across the pub like gravel being dragged over concrete, grating and unpleasant, and several of the regulars shot him dirty looks that he either didn't notice or didn't care about. He was the kind of man who'd never had to care what anyone thought of him, and it showed. He snapped his fingers at Leo without eye contact, the gesture dismissive and rude. Burger. Rare. Fries. Whatever the kid wants. Hurry up. Leo ignored him and crouched beside the booth until he was eye level with the boy. It was a small gesture, but one he'd learned early on. Getting down to a child's level, meeting their eyes, showing them they were worth the effort of kneeling on a sticky bar floor. It was something his mother had done with him when he was small, and it had made him feel seen, valued, important. He wanted this boy to feel the same way. Hey there, sweetheart. Same as usual. The boy didn't speak. He never had. Not once in 8 weeks, not a single word, not even a whimper or a sigh. But his eyes, those enormous, dark, fathomless eyes, lifted to meet Leo's. And the emptiness in them receded just enough to let something warm flicker through, like a match striking in a dark room, brief and fragile, but real. He gave a tiny nod, the movement so small it was almost invisible, a secret shared between them. Grilled cheese, extra crispy, crust cut off, tomato soup on the side. Leo whispered it like it was their secret code, their private language. Coming right up. Here was the thing Marty didn't know. Rourke ordered a kid's burger for the boy every night. A dry, sad-looking patty on a stale bun with a handful of fries that went cold within minutes, congealing into a greasy, unappetizing mess. The boy never touched it. It sat on the plate getting cold and unappealing until Rourke threw cash on the table and dragged him out, leaving behind an untouched monument to someone's idea of care that was really just neglect dressed up in obligation. But 2 months ago, on the boy's first visit, Leo had noticed him staring at the grilled cheese a construction worker was eating at the bar. The longing on that small face was so sharp it actually hurt to witness. A raw, hungry wanting that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with warmth, with attention, with being seen as something other than an inconvenience. It was the look of a child who had never been given anything just because someone wanted to make him happy. So Leo started making him one. He told Marty it was a comp for a complaint, a white lie that sat heavily on his conscience. He paid the difference out of his own tips, $4.50 a night. He absolutely did not have. $4.50 that could have gone towards Sophie's medication, toward the ever-growing mountain of debt, toward the rent that was already 3 months overdue. But every time the boy took a bite, something in Leo's chest unclenched. Some tight, anxious knot of worry loosened just a fraction. It wasn't much. It was barely anything. But it was something. Tonight, When Leo brought the food, the grilled cheese perfectly browned, the cheese melting in golden strings, the soup steaming in its little cup, the crusts carefully trimmed and arranged in a neat pile on the side, because Leo knew the boy liked them that way. Rourke was arguing so loudly into his phone that he didn't notice the grilled cheese at all. Didn't notice the way the boy's eyes lit up, the way his small hands reached for the plate with an almost desperate hunger, the way he breathed in the steam like it was the most wonderful smell in the world. The boy ate methodically, dipping each triangle into the soup with the focus of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. He chewed slowly, savoring, making the meal last as long as possible. He was a child who'd learned to hoard good things because he never knew when they'd come again. When he finished, he did something new. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was crumpled and worn, as if he'd been carrying it around for days, waiting for the right moment. He slid it across the table toward Leo, shielding the movement with his small body so Rourke couldn't see. His dark eyes were watchful, careful, the eyes of someone who'd learned to be stealthy. Leo palmed it and walked back to the bar, his heart hammering for reasons he couldn't explain. He unfolded it behind the register, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a drawing. Crayon on-line notebook paper. The kind you could buy at any drugstore for 99 cents. The kind that children in school used for their assignments. 2 stick figures. One tall with brown hair holding a plate, one small with dark curls. Between them, a yellow star that glowed like a tiny sun, radiating warmth and joy. Underneath, in wobbly capital letters that must have taken immense concentration to form. Each letter carefully shaped and reshaped until it was just right. My friend Leo. Leo pressed the drawing against his chest and blinked hard. The paper was warm from the boy's pocket, and something about that small transfer of heat felt impossibly precious. He could feel the tears burning behind his eyes, could feel the lump forming in his throat. He looked back at the booth. For one impossibly brief second, the corner of the child's mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but the memory of one. The ghost of something that might have been joy, if joy were still a thing this child remembered. It was there and gone in an instant, like a fleeting glimpse of sunlight through clouds, but Leo had seen it. Who are you, little one? Leo murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible over the clatter of the bar. And who's keeping you so sad? 3 weeks later, the routine shattered. It was a Thursday. Rain was hammering Boylston Street, so hard the gutters were foaming white, spilling over onto the sidewalks in sheets that soaked through shoes within seconds and turned the streets into rivers. The sky was the color of old bruises, dark and angry, and promising more of the same for hours to come. Sullivan's was packed with people escaping the downpour. Office workers in damp suits who'd given up on trying to stay dry. Off-duty firefighters who'd come in for a warm meal after a long shift. A cluster of college students who looked too young to be ordering anything stronger than soda, but were doing it anyway with the desperate bravado of the newly legal and newly liberated from parental oversight. Rourke and the boy were in their booth. Rourke looked worse than usual, gray-skinned and twitchy, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal's. Nursing a whiskey he wasn't supposed to be drinking on duty. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept glancing at his phone, waiting for something that wasn't coming. The boy, whose name Leo had learned was Eli from a monogrammed handkerchief he dropped once, a small square of white linen with EMV embroidered in elegant cursive, the initials of someone who mattered, was trying to open a juice box. His small fingers couldn't get the straw through the foil. He pushed too hard, his hands too small and too uncoordinated for the task, and the box crumpled. Juice splashed across the table and onto Rourke's sleeve, a dark stain spreading across the cheap fabric. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Rourke slammed down his glass. The sound cracked through the pub like a gunshot, silencing the chatter and the clinking of glasses. His hand shot out and grabbed Eli's upper arm, yanking him sideways so hard the boy's head snapped back. "The hell is wrong with you?" he hissed, loud enough to turn heads. "You sit still, and you shut your mouth." "Oh, wait. You already do that, don't you? Freak." Eli didn't cry. He didn't make a sound. He just went rigid, his body locking up like a frightened animal's, his eyes glazing over into that terrible 1,000-yard stare. It was the stillness of a child who had learned that freezing was safer than fighting, that any movement might make it worse, that the only way to survive was to become invisible. His small body trembled, but he made no sound, not even a whimper. Leo was halfway through pouring a gin and tonic when he saw Rourke's fingers digging into Eli's arm. He saw the white rings forming around the pressure points, the way the boy's small body trembled despite his desperate efforts to stay still. He saw the terror in those dark eyes, the acceptance of pain that shouldn't have been part of any child's experience. Something detonated inside Leo's chest. It was the same feeling he'd had sitting in the hospital when the billing office told him they were discontinuing Sophie's treatment unless he could produce $18,000 by Friday. The same hot, righteous, stupid fury that bypassed every survival instinct, every carefully cultivated habit of keeping his head down and his mouth shut. It was the fury of someone who had been pushed too far, too many times, and had finally run out of room to retreat. The fury of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore the most dangerous person in the room. He set the glass down with a thud that echoed through the suddenly quiet pub. Grabbed the heavy glass pitcher of ice water from the bar, the big one, the one that weighed almost 5 pounds when full, the one that was usually used for refilling water glasses on busy nights. Walked across the room, his footsteps loud in the sudden silence, the only sound besides the drumming rain. Take your hand off him. Rourke's lip curled. Mind your business, barmaid. I said take your hand off that child. Right now. Leo's voice didn't waver. It came out steady and cold, the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. He held the pitcher at an angle, ice water dripping from the lip, splashing onto the table between them in slow, deliberate droplets. Or I empty this on your head, and then I call the cops. Your choice. You've got 3 seconds. The pub had gone quiet. Completely, utterly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums like a physical weight. 2 off-duty firefighters at the bar were standing up, reading the room with a practiced assessment of men who'd seen violence before. A dozen phones were already recording, small glowing screens capturing every moment. Rourke laughed, but his eyes were calculating. He looked at the pitcher, at the firefighters, at the phones. He released Eli's arm. You're making a mistake you can't undo, Rourke said, standing up slowly. He towered over Leo by a full foot, all bulk and threat, his chest puffed out like a gorilla's. You don't know who you're messing with. I don't care if you work for God himself, Leo said. His voice was still steady, still cold, even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Get out. Leave him here. He'll finish his dinner. You can wait outside. Rourke jabbed a finger at Leo's face, so close he could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath, the sour smell of someone who'd been drinking too much for too long. You're done. You hear me? You're a dead man walking. He stormed out, shoving the door so hard the glass rattled in its frame. Through the rain-streaked window, Leo could see him pacing the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly. The rain soaked through his cheap polo shirt in seconds, plastering it to his skin, but he didn't seem to notice. Leo set the pitcher down. His hands were shaking so badly the ice cubes were clinking together like wind chimes, a soft, discordant music that seemed to mock him. He slid into the booth across from Eli, the torn vinyl cold against his thighs. Are you okay, honey? Eli rubbed the red marks on his arm, his small fingers gentle over the bruises. He looked at Leo with those enormous dark eyes, and for the first time, Leo saw something other than emptiness in them. Something raw and terrified and desperately hopeful all at once. The boy was trembling, his small body shaking with the aftermath of fear. Then he opened his mouth. A whisper came out, raspy and unused, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. The words were halting, as if he'd forgotten how to form them, as if speech itself was a foreign language he had to relearn from scratch. Papa, Eli breathed. Papa is coming. Your papa? Leo asked, startled. He'd assumed the boy was an orphan, or that his parents had abandoned him to the care of brutish men. Is he nice? Eli shook his head slowly. Then he nodded. Then he shook his head again, confused by his own answer. His small face crumpled with the effort of trying to reconcile conflicting truths, trying to understand a father who was both terrifying and beloved. He's scary, Eli whispered. But he's mine. Before Leo could respond, the street outside erupted. 3 black Mercedes sedans pulled up in a formation so tight they blocked the entire lane, their engines a low, menacing growl that cut through the drumming rain. They moved like a single entity, precise and coordinated. Rourke dropped his cigarette and went pale, his face draining of all color, his confident swagger evaporating in an instant. He looked like a man who'd just seen his own executioner. The door of the lead car opened, and a man stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, as if the weather wouldn't dare touch him, as if he was beyond such petty concerns. He was tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a black overcoat over a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the streetlight rather than reflect it. His hair was black, cropped close to his skull, with a streak of silver at the left temple that caught the dim glow of the streetlights like a flash of lightning. His face was angular, all sharp planes and hard lines. Handsome in the way a blade is handsome, beautiful and dangerous and completely without softness. A scar bisected his right eyebrow, pulling it into a permanent look of cold inquiry, as if he was constantly assessing and dismissing everything he saw. His eyes were black, so dark they seemed to swallow light, and they held nothing but the flat, patient stillness of a predator who had all the time in the world. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He walked toward Rourke with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once needed to hurry in his life. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, each one a statement of absolute control. The rain seemed to part around him, as if even the weather knew better than to interfere. He spoke 3 words. Leo couldn't hear them through the rain-streaked glass, but he watched Rourke crumble, literally crumble. The man's knees buckled and he sank to the wet sidewalk, hands raised, mouth moving in desperate supplication. He was begging. The big, brutish man who'd been so confident moments before was reduced to a quivering mess on the pavement, reduced to nothing by a few words and a cold stare. 2 men in black materialized from the second car, grabbed Rourke under the arms, and hauled him into the third vehicle. It happened in under 15 seconds. The rain washed away whatever small evidence remained, as if the whole thing had never happened. The man in the overcoat turned toward the pub. His eyes found Leo through the window, as if he'd known exactly where he was sitting, as if he'd been tracking him all along, watching him through the glass. He adjusted his cuffs, a small, precise gesture that somehow conveyed more menace than any overt threat, and walked toward the door. 4 men fell into formation around him, 2 ahead, 2 behind. They moved like shadows, like extensions of his will, their eyes scanning the street for threats that Leo couldn't see. Marty's voice came from the kitchen window, strangled and shaking. That's Konstantin Volkov. That's the Volkov family. Hide. Please, go out the back. Leo couldn't move. His hand was resting on Eli's shoulder, and the boy had gone still, but not with fear this time. With anticipation. With the quiet, patient waiting of someone who'd been expecting this moment, who'd been waiting for his father to come and save him. The door opened. Konstantin Volkov walked into Sullivan's pub, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The ambient noise of the bar, the clinking glasses, the murmured conversations, the tinny sound of the old jukebox, all of it stopped. Every person in that room knew, on some primal level, that they were in the presence of something dangerous. He didn't scan the room. He didn't acknowledge a single person. His eyes, black as his son's, black as the depths of the ocean, locked onto Leo with surgical focus. He crossed the room in 4 long strides and stopped 1 foot from the booth. He looked at Leo. Then he looked down at Eli. He saw the red marks on his son's arm. His jaw flexed. A vein pulsed at his temple. For a moment, something dark and terrible flickered in those black eyes, something that promised violence of a scale most people couldn't imagine. He was holding himself back with visible effort. He looked back at Leo. You. His voice was deep, accented faintly with something Eastern European that had been mostly ground away by years in America. It was the voice of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. You threatened my man with a pitcher of water. He was hurting your son, Leo said. His voice came out steadier than he felt, steadier than the trembling in his hands. And you decided it was your concern. A grown man hurting a child is everyone's concern. Silence. The bodyguards shifted behind Volkov, hands hovering near their waists. The entire pub held its breath. Leo could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the sweat trickling down his spine. Konstantin Volkov studied Leo's face the way someone studies a contract before signing it, with complete attention, with total absorption. He looked at the split lip, the trembling hands, the stubborn set of the jaw. He looked at the fear and the defiance warring in Leo's eyes. Then, so faintly that Leo almost missed it, the rigid line of his mouth softened. Just a fraction, barely perceptible, but it was there. He ate. He said quietly, looking at the empty plate. The soup bowl scraped clean. The grilled cheese reduced to crumbs. He ate everything. He eats here every night, Leo said. Not the burger your guy orders. Grilled cheese. Extra crispy, crusts off. He likes it dipped in tomato soup. Something passed through Konstantin Volkov's eyes. It wasn't warmth exactly. This man was too controlled, too careful for something as simple as warmth. It was the ghost of warmth. The memory of it surfacing through permafrost. A crack in the armor. A glimpse of the man he might have been before the world had made him hard. He reached into his coat. Leo flinched, every muscle in his body tensing for violence. But Volkov only pulled out a phone, typed something with quick, efficient movements, and put it away. Your shift is over. Excuse me. He looked at Marty, who was pressed against the kitchen doorway like he was trying to phase through the wood. He's done here. Pay him out. Yes, Mr. Volkov, Marty squeaked. His voice had gone up an octave. He was trembling so hard the keys in his hand jingled. I'm not going anywhere with you, Leo said, standing up, stepping in front of Eli on instinct. You can't just walk in here and... Leonardo Miles, Constantine said calmly. 29. Single. Somerville apartment. 18 months behind on rent. Sister Sophie Miles, age 17. Ewing sarcoma, currently in treatment at Mass General. Outstanding medical debt, $237,000. Checking account balance as of this morning, $42. The blood drained from Leo's face. His knees nearly buckled. How did this man know all of that? How long had he been watching? How deep did this surveillance go? I know everything about you, Mr. Miles. I've known since the second week my son started eating again. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Leo could hear. His proximity was overwhelming. The scent of expensive cologne, the warmth of his body, the sheer presence of him. Get in the car. Your sister gets the best oncologist in the country within the month. Her debt disappears tonight. Walk away, and we both lose. He extended his hand to Eli. Picula, Eli. Eli slipped out of the booth. He took his father's hand, but he turned and looked at Leo with those dark, pleading eyes. The same look Sophie gave him every time he left the hospital room. The look that said, please don't go. Please don't leave me here alone. Leo looked at the drawing in his apron pocket. My friend Leo. He thought about Sophie. 17 years old, hooked up to a machine, cracking jokes to hide the fact that she was terrified. He thought about the number 42 and what it could buy. Nothing. It could buy nothing. It couldn't buy a single dose of medication, couldn't buy a single day of treatment, couldn't buy the hope that Sophie was slowly running out of. He untied his apron and dropped it on the bar. I need to call my sister first. You'll be issued a new phone, Constantine said, already walking toward the door. Bring nothing. The drive to the Volkov estate took 45 minutes north along the coast, past Salem, past Marblehead, into the stretch of shoreline where old money had built fortresses behind walls of imported stone and centuries-old oak trees. The landscape grew wilder, more isolated. The houses larger and further apart until they disappeared entirely, replaced by iron gates and security cameras and the occasional glimpse of the churning Atlantic through the trees. The car was a Maybach, silent as a coffin. The leather seats were buttery soft, the interior lit with soft ambient lighting that did nothing to make Leo feel less like a prisoner being transported to an unknown fate. The windows were tinted so dark he could barely see out of them. Leo sat on one side. Constantine sat on the other. Eli had wedged himself between them, his small body pressed against Leo's side, his small hand gripping Leo's fingers with surprising strength. Leo held the boy's hand without thinking about it, his thumb tracing soothing circles on the small knuckles. Constantine noticed. His eyes dropped to their interlaced fingers. He said nothing, but something flickered in his expression, something complicated and unreadable. "Why me?" Leo asked the tinted window. The rain was still falling, streaking the glass, turning the passing landscape into a blur of gray and green. "Because, in 14 months, Constantine said without looking up from his tablet, 11 nannies have quit. 3 child psychologists have failed. 2 au pairs lasted less than a week. My son has not spoken a single word to any of them." He turned the tablet toward Leo. A live security feed showed a hospital room. Sophie was asleep, her face pale and thin against the white pillow, and 4 in her arm. A new nurse, competent-looking, with kind eyes and steady hands, was checking her vitals. "He spoke to you tonight. That is worth more than you can calculate." Leo stared at his sister's sleeping face on the screen and felt the last of his resistance dissolve. He'd spent so long fighting, so long trying to hold everything together with nothing but hope and stubbornness. And here was someone offering to take it all away. The death, the fear, the endless nights of wondering if he'd be able to save her. But at what cost? The estate emerged from the fog like something out of a Gothic novel, a sprawling stone manor perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The waves below crashed against rocks with a sound like muffled artillery, a constant, rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Iron gates, guard posts, surveillance cameras mounted on every pillar. Men in dark suits patrolled the grounds, their eyes scanning the perimeter with professional vigilance. "Welcome to Ashford Point," Constantine said as the car stopped on the gravel drive. Inside, the house was a cathedral of dark wood, marble, and silence. A massive staircase swept upward into shadow, its banisters carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Oil paintings lined the walls, generations of faces that all shared the same black eyes, the same cold distance. The air smelled of old books and sea salt, and something faintly metallic that Leo would later learn was the residue of paranoia. A woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the warmth of a January nor'easter met them in the foyer. Her face was all sharp angles and unyielding lines, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "Mr. Miles, I presume. I'm Mrs. Calloway, the house manager. Follow me." Constantine disappeared down a corridor without a word, his footsteps echoing on the marble. Eli ran upstairs, his small shoes slapping against the stone, his small form disappearing into the shadows. Leo followed Mrs. Calloway to a bedroom in the east wing that was larger than his entire Somerville apartment. 4-poster bed with silk sheets. Private bathroom with marble fixtures. A closet already filled with clothes in his size. Practical things, good quality, nothing flashy. Jeans and sweaters and comfortable shoes. Someone had thought about what he would need. A gilded cage is still a cage, Leo thought. But a cage where Sophie gets treatment is a cage worth sitting in. That evening, he found Eli in a playroom the size of a basketball court. Every toy was pristine. Dolls still in their boxes, action figures still sealed in plastic, board games still wrapped in cellophane. None had been touched. They were decorations, not playthings, carefully arranged to give the appearance of a happy childhood. Eli was sitting on the floor by the window, staring at the ocean through rain-streaked glass. His small knees were drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around them. He looked impossibly small against the vastness of the sea. Mind if I sit? Leo asked. Eli patted the floor beside him. They sat together, watching the storm batter the coast. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the churning waves. The wind howled around the corners of the manor, making the old windows rattle in their frames. After 20 minutes, Eli leaned his head against Leo's arm and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, deepened. The small hand that had been gripping Leo's shirt relaxed. Later, when Leo tried to leave for his own room, Eli grabbed his hand and pointed frantically at the bed. The panic in his eyes was real and raw, the desperate fear of someone who'd been left alone too many times. Leo kicked off his shoes and lay on top of the covers. Eli curled into his side like a small animal seeking warmth and was asleep in minutes. His small body was limp with exhaustion, his face peaceful for the first time since Leo had met him. At 1 a.m., Leo's throat was dry. He eased away from Eli, careful not to wake him, and padded down the hallway toward the kitchenette Mrs. Calloway had pointed out. The house was silent in the way of old buildings, full of small creaks and groans, the settling of wood and stone, the whisper of wind through ancient walls. As he filled a glass at the sink, he noticed a door across the hall, slightly ajar, a faint blue glow leaking from the crack. It was the color of computer screens, of surveillance monitors. Constantine had made the rules clear during a brief, terrifying conversation in his study that afternoon. Rule 1, absolute discretion. Rule 2, never leave the grounds without escort. Rule 3, stay in his lane, Eli only. Nothing else. But the blue light pulled at him. He pushed the door open. It was a small, windowless room. A bank of monitors showed live feeds from cameras around the estate. He saw Eli's room, the small figure curled up in the massive bed. The hallway he'd just walked through. The front gate. The grounds, patrolled by silent men in dark suits. And his own bedroom from an overhead angle. The bed still perfectly made, untouched. He stood there, skin crawling, processing the violation. He'd known he was being watched, but seeing it, seeing the evidence of it, the cold, clinical reality, was something else entirely. Then he saw what was taped to the wall beside the monitors. Crayon on paper. The same shaky hand as the one in his apron pocket. But this one was different. This one was a nightmare. Black and red. Violent scribbles that seemed to pulse with barely contained rage. A car engulfed in orange and yellow flames. The fire rendered in furious, jagged strokes. A figure lying on the ground covered in red. A body, clearly, a person who had been caught in the blast. And standing over the burning car, a tall figure in black. The figure's arm was raised. On the wrist, drawn with painstaking detail that clashed with the crude style of the rest, as if the child had been desperate to get this one detail exactly right, was something blue. Not a ring. A watch. A very specific watch with a blue face, the hands frozen at some precise time. And coming from the figure's mouth, in jagged letters inside a speech bubble, quiet. Leo's blood went cold. A floorboard groaned behind him. He spun. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stone floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. Konstantin Volkov stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark robe over sleep pants, his hair rumpled, his eyes heavy-lidded with interrupted sleep. But his face was carved from granite. His eyes moved from the broken glass to the monitors to the drawing on the wall. I gave you rules, Leo. His whisper was worse than any shout Leo had ever heard. It was the quiet of absolute control, of someone who was used to being obeyed. I can explain. You can't. He stepped inside and closed the door. The room shrank to the size of a closet. Leo could smell him. That expensive cologne, now mixed with the scent of sleep. Could feel the heat radiating from his body. Could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. Tell me what you see in that drawing. I see a man watching the car burn. He's not helping. He's telling someone to be quiet. And he's wearing a watch. A blue-faced watch. Konstantin closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the rage was gone, replaced by something far more devastating. Exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of someone who had been fighting for too long. I don't wear watches, he said. He held up his bare wrists. I haven't worn one since I was 20. My husband used to joke about it. His voice caught on the word husband. He cleared his throat, a rough, painful sound. The bomb was planted by the Petrov syndicate. But they couldn't have gotten to my car without someone inside opening the garage remotely. Someone I trusted. Someone close. He tapped the drawing. The blue watch face. Eli saw him. He saw the man who let them in. He saw him standing outside when the car exploded. And he told Eli to be quiet. That's why he stopped speaking? Not trauma. Terror. He's afraid that if he talks, the man with the blue watch will come back. Leo felt sick. His stomach churned, and he had to lean against the wall to stay upright. You're telling me the person who killed your husband is still in this house? I'm telling you I've spent 18 months looking at every wrist in this compound, and I haven't found him. He leaned against the wall opposite Leo, and for one unguarded moment, he looked like what he was, a shattered widower failing to protect his son. The mask of control slipped, and underneath was just a man who had lost everything and was desperately trying to hold on to what remained. You're new, Leo. You have no ties to my organization. You're the only person here I can be certain isn't the traitor. Eli trusts you. He draws for you. Help me find the man with the blue watch, and I will give you anything. Then I put you back on the street with your $42, and your sister stays on the waiting list. The threat was surgical. He knew exactly where to cut. Leo looked at the drawing. He thought of Eli's whispered words in the pub. He's scary, but he's mine. He thought of Sophie's pale face in the hospital bed. He thought of the $42 in his bank account. Okay, he said. I'll help. The next morning, Leo began watching. He watched the gardener's wrists as he pruned the hedges, looking for the telltale band of pale skin that indicated a recently removed watch. He watched the chef's forearms as he chopped onions, noting every flash of bare skin. He watched Mrs. Calloway's hands, always precise, always steady, but always bare. He watched the drivers, the bodyguards, the housekeepers, everyone who moved through the house with the casual confidence of the trusted. He watched everyone. Eli was brighter now. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The way his eyes tracked Leo across a room, the way he smiled when Leo entered, the way he reached out to touch Leo's hand when they sat together. He was still silent, still careful, but there was something lighter in him. The shadows under his eyes were less pronounced, and he was eating better, sleeping more. Leo took him to the conservatory, a glass room overlooking the ocean, filled with Constantine's late husband's orchid collection. It was a beautiful space, all light and life and color, a stark contrast to the rest of the dark manor. The orchids were exquisite, delicate blooms in shades of purple and white and deep, velvety red, carefully tended by someone who had loved them. They were painting watercolors. Leo had found the supplies in a cabinet, untouched, as if no one had ever thought to use them. He'd set up 2 easels by the window, and now they were working in companionable silence. The only sounds the scratch of brushes on paper and a distant crash of waves. Eli wasn't bad at it. His small hands were surprisingly steady, and his eye for color was remarkable. The painting taking shape on his paper was a simple scene, a stick figure standing on a beach, holding hands with a smaller figure. But the colors were vivid, alive. You know, Leo said casually, mixing blue paint on his palette. My grandpa had this big old watch. Silver with a white face. Really clunky. He used to let me wind it when I was little. I thought it was the most magical thing in the world. Eli's brush stopped. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, the way they always did when he was checking for threats. Then he dipped his brush in blue paint and, on a clean sheet of paper, painted a circle. Inside the circle, he painted a smaller circle with blue filling. Around the edge, tiny white lines, hour markers. It was unmistakable, a watch face. And beside the watch face, he painted something else. A small red cross. A medical cross. Leo's heart hammered. Someone in this house with medical access. Someone whose job required them to be near the family, to be trusted. Leo? Eli. The voice made them both jump. Duncan Briggs stood in the doorway. Head of security. Ex-military, fit, always polite, with a quick smile and an easy manner that made everyone trust him. He was the one Constantine relied on most, the one who ran the guard rotations, the one who had access to every system in the house, including the garage. He was universally liked, universally trusted. He was the kind of man who could be standing in the middle of a room and you'd barely notice him until he wanted to be noticed. He was wearing his usual tactical gear, dark pants, a fitted shirt, a holster at his hip. His sleeves were rolled to the forearms, revealing tanned, muscular arms that looked like they'd seen plenty of action. No watch. Bare wrists. But on his left forearm, a tan line. A band of pale skin where something had sat for years and been recently removed. The contrast was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Leo had been looking. And on the inside of his right wrist, a tattoo so small Leo had to squint to see it. A red cross. The same red cross Eli had just painted. Briggs saw Leo staring. His eyes flicked to the watercolor paper where Eli's painting was still wet. The blue watch. The red cross. His smile didn't change. But his eyes went flat. Dead as a shark's. The warmth drained out of them, replaced by something cold and calculating. He was reassessing, recalculating. Smart kid, Briggs said softly. Leo grabbed Eli and shoved the child behind his back. His heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his system. Eli, run. Run to your father. Now. I really wish you hadn't done that, Briggs said. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. Team 2, initiate contingency. Packages burned. Moving on primary. No. Leo screamed. He seized a heavy crystal vase from the windowsill. A beautiful thing, full of fresh orchids, and hurled it at Briggs's head. Briggs ducked, but it clipped his shoulder, water and flowers exploding everywhere. It bought Leo a precious second. Run, Eli. Go. Eli bolted. His small feet slapped against the hardwood as he sprinted toward the main staircase. He was fast, faster than Leo would have expected, his small body driven by pure survival instinct. Briggs lunged for Leo. Leo didn't know how to fight. He'd never thrown a punch in his life. But he'd grown up in Dorchester, and Dorchester boys don't go down easy. He drove his knee into Briggs's stomach, surprising him enough to stumble backward into the orchid display. Pots crashed. Soil and petals scattered across the marble floor in a chaos of color and debris. Briggs recovered fast. Too fast. He was trained, experienced, and Leo was just a bartender. He backhanded Leo across the face, the force of it sending him spinning into the paint table. Colors exploded across the floor in a grotesque rainbow, blue and red and yellow mixing into muddy brown. He tasted copper, felt blood welling from his split lip. Briggs straightened his collar, looking at Leo with contempt. Stay down, bartender. He drew a suppressed pistol from his thigh holster and walked calmly after Eli. Not running, not hurrying, just walking, with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew he had all the time in the world. Terror cut through the pain like ice water. Leo spat blood and hauled himself upright, ignoring the screaming in his ribs. Muffled pops from the west wing, gunshots, suppressed, but unmistakable. Alarms began screaming through the house, a rising wail that vibrated in his teeth, shattering the silence. He ran barefoot, bleeding from a split lip, sprinting through the corridors. The marble was cold and slick under his feet. He needed a weapon. Anything. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from a fireplace in the sitting room, the metal cold and solid and satisfying in his grip. He rounded the corner toward Constantine's study and skidded to a halt. Two men in tactical gear were positioned outside the double doors, firing bursts into the study. Bullets chewed through the wood, splinters flying. Constantine was pinned inside, returning fire through the door. Leo gripped the poker. He wasn't a soldier. He was a bartender from South Boston who couldn't afford his rent. But these men were trying to kill the person who was saving his sister's life. And more importantly, they were between a little boy and his father. He crept forward. The gunfire covered his footsteps. He was close now, close enough to see the sweat on the men's necks, to smell the cordite and fear. He swung the poker with everything he had. It connected with the back of the first man's neck with a sickening crunch. He went down hard, collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. The second spun around, his eyes wide with surprise, and Leo swung again, catching him across the wrist. His rifle clattered to the floor. Leo hit him once more in the temple, and he crumpled. He kicked the doors open. Constantine was crouched behind his desk, reloading a handgun with quick, efficient movements. He saw Leo standing in the doorway, hair wild, face bloody, split lip, holding an iron poker like a medieval warrior. Something in his expression cracked open. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely. "Where's Eli?" Leo gasped, sliding behind the desk as more bullets chewed the doorframe. "It's Briggs. He has a red cross tattoo on his wrist. He wore a blue-faced watch. Eli painted it. He went after him toward the nursery." Constantine's face transformed into something inhuman. Pure, focused wrath. The cold mask was gone, replaced by the fury of a father whose child was in danger. "Briggs," he repeated, and the name sounded like a death sentence. He stood, stepped out from behind the desk, and fired 3 precise shots at the hallway. 3 thuds as bodies hit the floor. He didn't check. "Stay behind me," he said. "No." Leo gripped his poker, his knuckles white. "He needs to see me." Constantine looked at him. His black eyes searched Leo's face, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. He nodded. They moved through the house together. Constantine cleared rooms with brutal efficiency, his gun a seamless extension of his will. Leo followed, heart slamming, knuckles white around the iron bar. They encountered resistance, more of Briggs's men, scattered throughout the manor, and Constantine dispatched them with cold, professional speed. They reached the east wing. Eli's door was open. The window to the balcony was shattered, curtains whipping in the sea wind, rain blowing in through the broken glass. "The widow's walk," Constantine hissed. "The roof." They climbed the exterior ladder to the flat observation deck on the manor's highest point. Wind screamed off the Atlantic, carrying salt spray and the sound of waves smashing the cliffs below. The fog was thick, swirling around them like a living thing, reducing visibility to a few feet. Briggs was at the edge. He had Eli by the collar of his nightgown, one hand gripping the fabric, the other holding a pistol pressed against the boy's side. Eli was crying silently, tears streaming down his face, his small body trembling. But he made no sound. He'd learned that lesson too well. "Stop!" Constantine roared, freezing 10 feet away. He raised his weapon, but Briggs positioned Eli in front of him like a shield, using the boy's small body to block any shot. "Drop it, Volkov," Briggs shouted over the wind. "Drop it, or he goes over." Constantine slowly bent and placed his gun on the wet stone. He raised his hands, palms out. "Let him go. It's me you want. Take the Empire. Take all of it. Just let him go. You took everything from me first." Briggs screamed, his composure finally cracking. The mask of easy charm was gone, replaced by raw, ugly hatred. 18 months I've been in your house, eating at your table, waiting for this. You think I killed Dmitri for business? He was collateral. This was always about you, Constantine. You destroyed my family in Odessa. You don't even remember their names." He tightened his grip on Eli. The boy whimpered, a small, helpless sound that cut through the wind like a knife. Leo stood slightly behind Constantine, hidden in the fog. Briggs was focused entirely on his enemy, all his attention on the man who had wronged him. Leo looked around. There was nothing on the roof, no weapons, no tools. Just him and the poker. In a half-second window, if he could create one. "Hey!" he shouted, stepping out of the fog. Briggs's eyes snapped to him. Instinct. Just a fraction of a second. "You forgot something." "What?" Briggs sneered, his lip curling. "He's not quiet anymore." And Eli, who had not raised his voice in 18 months, who had whispered only a handful of words since the day his father died, who had been silent for so long that everyone had forgotten what his voice sounded like, screamed. It was a raw, primal, shattering sound that cut through the wind like a blade. It was the sound of a child who had been silent for too long, who had finally found his voice. It was the sound of breaking free. It startled Briggs. His grip loosened for one instant. Constantine moved. He crossed the distance in a blur, tackling Briggs away from the edge. The gun went off. Leo felt heat slice across his ribs, felt the burn of the bullet grazing his side. But he was already running, already moving, grabbing Eli and pulling the screaming child into his arms. He stumbled away from the grappling men, cradling Eli against his chest. Briggs was younger, trained. But Constantine was fighting with something beyond training, with desperation, with love, with the fury of a man protecting his child. He drove his fist into Briggs's throat with a sound like a branch snapping. Briggs choked, doubled over, his eyes bulging. Constantine grabbed him by the vest and lifted him off his feet. "For Dmitri," Constantine said. He threw Briggs off the roof. The scream lasted 2 seconds. It ended with a wet, sickening sound that was swallowed by the rocks below and the indifferent ocean. Silence. Just the wind and the waves and the breathing of 3 people who should have been dead. Constantine turned. Blood ran from a gash on his cheekbone, and his hands were shaking. He looked at Leo, clutching his bleeding side, holding his son. He dropped to his knees on the wet stone. "Eli," he choked. "Eli Moisinik." His voice was broken, ragged. The voice of a man who had almost lost everything. Eli pulled his face from Leo's chest. He looked at his father, kneeling before him, bloody and broken and shaking, tears streaming down his face. He reached out one small hand and touched Constantine's cheek. "Papa," he said. His voice was thin but clear, stronger than the wind. "I'm not quiet anymore." Konstantin Volkov, the man who controlled every port from Boston to Baltimore, the man whose name made federal prosecutors lose their appetites, the man who had killed more people than Leo could imagine, pressed his forehead against his son's hand and wept. 8 months later, the pub on the corner of Boylston and Exeter didn't say Sullivan's anymore. The sign read Miles in hand-painted lettering, the letters crisp and clean against the dark wood. Inside, the walls were covered with children's watercolors, vivid, joyful scenes of stick figures and suns and animals and flowers. The menu was small, handwritten on a chalkboard. The grilled cheese was famous, the best in Boston, according to the local food blog. Leo stood behind the bar, not in an apron this time, but in a cashmere sweater and boots that cost more than his old rent. His split lip had healed, leaving behind a faint scar that he'd grown oddly fond of. The door opened. Constantine walked in wearing jeans and a pea coat, looking less like a man who could end dynasties and more like a father running late for dinner. His hair was longer now, the silver streak more pronounced, and there was something softer in his face, something that hadn't been there before. Eli was beside him, chattering about his art teacher and the kitten they were adopting, and whether Leo would let him help make soup tomorrow. He never stopped talking now, as if he was making up for 18 months of silence all at once. They sat in the back booth. Their booth. Leo walked over. He didn't need a pad. He knew their order by heart. Grilled cheese, extra crispy, crusts off, and soup? He asked Eli. Eli grinned, his dark eyes sparkling. "And Papa wants coffee." Constantine reached across the table and took Leo's hand. On his ring finger, where no jewelry had ever been, sat a simple gold band. On Leo's hand was a matching one. "Only if you sit with us," Constantine said. His voice was low, intimate, meant only for Leo. "I own the place," Leo said, sliding into the booth beside him. "I do what I want." Eli pulled out a napkin and uncapped a marker, one he kept in his coat pocket at all times now. He drew quickly, his small tongue poking out in concentration, and turned it around. 3 stick figures. Tall man, man with brown hair, small boy in a beret. Underneath, in steady confident letters, family. Leo leaned his head on Constantine's shoulder. The older man's arm came around him, pulling him close. Through the window, Boylston Street was washed in golden evening light, the kind of light that makes even a rough city look like it's trying to be gentle. The kind of light that promises hope. "Thank you." Constantine murmured against his hair. For everything. For seeing him. For saving him. Thank you, Leo replied softly. For saving Sophie. For saving me. Eli climbed onto Leo's lap, demanding attention, and Leo laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind he hadn't known he was capable of. The weight that had been pressing down on his shoulders for so long was gone, replaced by something lighter. He looked around the pub, his pub now, his name on the door, the walls covered with Eli's art, the regulars who'd become friends, the life he'd built from the ashes of the old one. And that is the story of how a grilled cheese sandwich, $4.50 a night, changed everything. You really never know who's sitting in your section, or whose life you might save just by paying attention. Sometimes the smallest kindness ripples outward, touching lives you'll never even know about. Sometimes saving one person saves you too. The sun was setting over Boylston Street, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and deep, gentle purple. Leo watched it through the window, feeling the warmth of Constantine's arm around him and Eli's small body curled up in his lap. This was his life now. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't simple. But it was his. And it was more than he'd ever dared to hope for.